So, I am so curious to hear y'all's opinion after this one. Today, we're going to be talking about what I call the private equity mafia strategy. It's literally taken out of a book from the mob movies we've all grown to love and enjoy. They don't make as many of those anymore. Back in the day when I was coming up, you had the movies like Goodfellas, Godfather, just a whole genre. Casino. It's endless. I feel like after the 2000s, we haven't seen many new ones. We had The Sopranos, which was really, really amazing. But this strategy is basically a private equity strategy, which is a take on this. Some of the companies that you've seen go through some crazy changes, even go out of business, have been a result of this strategy with private equity pulling the strings behind the scenes. Now, you can do this strategy in a very malicious way and make a ton of money, but you can also do this in a fair way and also make a ton of money. I like to just do it in a fair way. That's what I want you to do as well. Now, when if you read the Wall Street Journal, like there was a lot of talk about private equity being behind the scenes of Toys R Us, which was for me just kind of devastating blow to my childhood and memories when that went out of business. But they've also been behind things like Baskin Robbins, J. Crew. Got had a bunch of debt taken on with this, and almost faced some really huge issues. Hertz, 24 Hour Fitness, Dunkin' Donuts, and then there was a deal even with Taylor Swift, which was really interesting. That private equity fund kind of used this strategy. So, what we're going to be talking about is how you can structure deals and what not to do when it comes to this private equity mafia strategy, but also how a lot of larger private equity funds have quite frankly taken advantage of businesses, taken advantage of our economy, and enriched themselves in an incredible pace through this process. So let's jump into it. Now, for some of you who are newer, private equity, simplest form, it just refers to investing in assets outside of the public market. It's something I think you should be doing. It's where wealth is created. When you look at the billionaires list, it's not created from them investing in a 401k, investing in the IRA, investing in the stock market. It's investing in privately owned businesses that eventually go public. So, in that world, you have firms like Blackstone, like KKR, Carlyle, Apollo. And so all of these businesses are in the business of managing funds. It's a business that I think all of y'all should be investing in. And I think a lot of you should be creating on your own. So when they're managing the fund, the investors are basically entrusting them with their money to make wise investment choices. And so, one perspective on some of the strategies we're going to talk about today and some of the tactics is hey, they're working for their investors, getting the absolute maximum return. But we do need to focus on how some of the strategies really do cause concern, and it's because of just a very intense use of leveraged buyouts. So let's make a parallel to as to why I call this the mafia strategy. If you think of how at least the mafia was depicted in movies, like the ones I mentioned, Goodfellas, The Sopranos, what they will do is one of their tactics, and Tony did this with a camping store. If you haven't watched The Sopranos, for some of you younger folks, classic, you just got to watch that. So in this camping example, he goes in, it's this profitable small business. The guy gets into a little bit of gambling debt, and now he starts to burden him with other debts. Like, oh, you know what? You ain't even have to pay me back. We're just going to borrow some money against your business and do this other thing. And so it just ends up getting him. He makes the deal. The guy, the business owner makes the deal. It's like, oh yeah, that sounds good. But bottom line is, they're going to burden the business with a bunch of debt, and then use that to leverage their advantage. And in the camping example, the guy ends up like sleeping at the very end. He ends up sleeping in a tent inside the store. And Tony comes in and is like, the guy's like, man, it just seems like you're trying to put me out of business. What are you doing? I had a perfectly good business. Seems like you got to put me out of business. And Tony kind of just puts his hand on the guy. He's like, yes, that's exactly what we're doing. So in this case, and in the private equity case, they basically accumulate massive, massive debt. They take on a bunch of goods, they take on a bunch of credit. And when the owners can't pay the mafia, And the old school method was literally they would make sure the insurance was maxed out and they would literally burn the place down. Now, private equity doesn't burn the place down. But let's talk about what private equity does. So, in private equity, you would probably start this process with something that would be a leveraged buyout. Because as most of y'all know, like we just call us LBOs for short. I love them. They have created some of the biggest jumps in wealth in the history of capitalism. So it is a very powerful strategy, literally one of the most powerful strategy in the economic system we call capitalism. The crucial difference is that, unlike what the mafia is doing and like having some kind of criminal activity, is everything we're talking about with the private equity side of things is 100% legal. LBOs are entirely legal. We're not talking about a legality thing. In some cases, it might be just a little more ethical. So you're going to be in these situations if you're in private equity where you're making just ethical decisions. So just because you give a crime kind of this businessy front and brand, it doesn't make it right, right? So an example would be you can't legally commit a murder by calling it lifespan termination agreement or whatever. But let's talk about this in this strategy in the business context because I think there are pointers that you can pull out which are really important. The first thing that you have to understand is that businesses do go out of business. This is something that private equity firms understand, and it's something that entrepreneurs understand. But for some reason, sometimes you get into this world and people don't understand that businesses do go out of business. You may buy a business and it goes out of business, and so if you know how to make money off of that when that business goes out of business, that can be a very powerful thing because it's kind of like what I talk about when I talk about the trading strategy and being strategic there. What you want to create is a win-win, and that's where all of this started. Is okay? How can we make money if the business goes out of business, or if the business isn't either way? If the business grows, if business saying the business goes out of business, you want to create these scenarios where you can literally make money no matter what happens in that business. So, in the business context, when you're thinking about that leverage, the first part of leverage buyout, it just refers to borrow money. There's nothing complicated there. It's just debt. You're using that debt like you would to buy a house. You're purchasing an asset. In a leverage buyout, a private equity firm would use the debt to buy a company. And in some cases, that loan may be more substantial than others. So while the responsibility is for paying all of the debt, it falls on the acquired company. Obviously that acquired company is owned by them, but the private equity firm itself doesn't have to pay that debt, so they're separated. This is one of the powerful things about a private equity fund. When you're structuring those things, that is a separate thing that has its own debt and everything. So um, if since it's not on the private equity fund, they're not as careful in a lot of cases to make sure that the debt load isn't too significant. Because within that company, you've got employees, you've got all these things, and it does suck. And so, even with me, we've had private equity deals where the deal doesn't work out, and so you're having to lay off employees and that kind of thing. And we don't go in intending for that to happen, like in the Tony Soprano play case, where the guy's like, it seems like you're just trying to put me out of business. He's like, yes, that is exactly what we're doing here. We're getting the maximum amount of money in the shortest period of time. The mafia is not known for like long-term view. Oh, let's just get this little bit over. It's like, no, we're about to maximize the most amount of money and just drive you out of business, sir. So if you go in there with that attitude, that is the mafia strategy. But no matter what, no matter how amazing at doing deals, putting together deals, you're going to have deals that go out of business. And so you've got to understand how to manage those situations as well. And this, strategy comes in handy when you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I manage my way through a situation where the business is going out of business? And the great thing about private equity is you can make money in every single situation. You can make money when the business is going out of business. You make money when the business doesn't do as well as it's supposed to. You can make money when the business does better than it's supposed to. Like every situation, if you understand the creativity behind private equity, which is the real value, then it does become a very, very beautiful, beautiful game. Right. So, somebody goes in there and they're putting 90% of the value in debt and, they're putting up 10% of it. which is cash. It's not as if that 10% isn't important. So most firms aren't going in just saying, hey, we're going to burn this thing to the ground, figuratively. So private equity firms will basically, most of the time, claim that they're saving a struggling business. But if you go in and you put too much debt on a struggling business, then that does by default make it more struggling. So, I think it's also really cool to understand that what's going on. Like when you read some of these articles of what happens to companies behind the scenes, it's really cool to just understand, like, oh, this is what they're doing, because this isn't something that's happening on the fringe. It happens all the time. If you go back to 2021, there was about 8,500 leverage buyouts, and people don't really appreciate that this is a really, really big thing. And so it's not like, oh, let me go and understand how to play this private equity game. And, it's just like nobody really does this. It's just that you don't do it. Poor people don't do it. Most people don't understand how it works. But no, like just in 2021, haven't gotten the last year's numbers, but it was over a trillion. It's like 1.25 trillion dollars in transactions. So this is a common thing. It happens all the time, a common occurrence, and it impacts you whether you realize it or not. And there's a ton of money being made. And so you've got to decide, do I want to learn that $1 trillion game or not? Now, the really cool thing is most of that is done by billionaires and people playing it at a very large level. But I love the fact that we also are able to play that game. So let's examine how leverage buyouts affect like you or workers and that kind of thing. So if a private equity fund takes over the business, then they tend to prioritize paying off the debt because they want to get that build. They want to build that equity and get that out of the way. Now that's going to be at the expense of some of the other things. So you've got to lay off employees. You got to get rid of marketing. You got to get rid of some of those things. So layoffs are one of the most common things, and on average, about 13% of the jobs are going to be cut. And again, that's this average. And so you have some people that are going in and they kind of know where it's like, okay, we're going to take this bet. Again, going back to the private equity mafia strategy, where they're going in, it's like, yo, we're going to buy 10 of these things. We're going to make a 10% down payment on all of them. We know that half of them aren't going to fail, but we're going to get really aggressive. We're going to make such a good return on the other five that it's going to win. So if you look at from like 2009 to 2019, private equity got rid of about 1.3 million retail jobs. That's a bunch of jobs. But right now, it's a good thing they did. We're at like a 3% unemployment rate, which is like absolutely unreal and amazing. So, there's just a tremendous amount of cost cutting. It can impact the consumers as well. The thing that I hate the most is when they do this in the healthcare industry. So, I am not, like a private equity fanboy. It's just like, oh man, whatever they do is great. It's like, no, they do some horrible things. Like I've seen some deals that were in like the nursing home space where it was absolutely disgusting what was happening in those. What was happening with like getting rid of staff and having the staff levels at the bare minimum, people not being able to get the help they need, and just having increased mortality rates. So that's absolutely 100% disgusting. And why I do I do call it something pretty intense, which is like the mafia strategy, because it's like, okay, this isn't illegal, but this is completely outrageous. Like I said, my most beloved example was like Toys R Us, because for all of us who grew up in the 90s, it was a big deal when it was bought by, it's a partnership. It was basically a coalition of private equity funds. And then they brought in some real estate firms because they're going to do a strategy, which I actually do love, which is the Sears example that we talk about in the private equity training program, private equity fund incubator. And so, that was a deal that was done in like 2005. And the toy chain at that point already had debt. And then they put billions of dollars of debt on it in addition to the debt it had. And basically within 2 years of the transaction, all of the profits were being spent on interest payments. So there was no room for innovation. There was no room for adapting. There was basically just like, okay, we are stuck. And what was happening in 2005 for you young folks is that it was the internet. So the internet was kind of burgeoning. And you had this digital age where they just couldn't compete. And so you had the impact of private equity that basically just sped up and had a lack of ability to respond. So they basically just end up going out of business. And it was a sad day for kids all over America. So, in general, about 20% of the public companies get taken private. That from being public companies by private equity, and about 20% will go bankrupt. And like I said before, a lot of these are already struggling businesses, so that isn't as big of an issue. And I think it's important that we remember, not everybody that's investing and making money off of this is billionaires. The reason they have all that money is because they're getting retirement money, they're getting pension funds, teacher funds, firefighter funds, police funds, so public workers contribute for their retirement. And so those private equity funds are delivering on a promise they made to those investors. So I am very curious if you're interested in this strategy. If you're interested in learning about private equity, shoot me a text to the phone number below or the email, and I would love to show you more about what we're doing. I've got a course where we take people through this process of creating your own private equity fund. So check that out. In the meantime, tell me your thoughts. Like, what are your thoughts on, like, do you think this is a good thing? You think, hey, it's just business. It's how business works. That's what we are. We're a capitalist society. And yeah, let me know what your thoughts are on this whole thing. Be sure to subscribe. I love your feedback. Check out the Patreon, and I will talk to you again